everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lucy Westcott, and I am the Emergencies Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ, one of three organizations leading this US Election Safety Summer Training Series. And as we've done at the beginning of every session, we would love to know where people are joining us from today, so please feel free to pop that in the chat. So thank you for joining us today for the fourth session of this six-part series, Legal Rights and Resources, covering the 2024 US election. We are very proud to offer this critical training to journalists in the lead up to the election, and this series has been co-organized and led with our fantastic partners who we are very, very grateful to, the International Women's Media Foundation, or the IWMF, and PEN America. I would also like to thank our wonderful supporting partners who you can see here on the screen, the Online News Association, the Indigenous Journalists Association, Report for America, the American Press Institute, the Society of Professional Journalists, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the ACOS Alliance, Writers Guild of America East, and the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So our webinars take place every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time. So welcome back if you've been to one of our webinars before. If not, welcome. And we have covered and are covering physical, digital, legal, and psychosocial safety for journalists who are covering the upcoming election. By the end of this series, we hope journalists will have a comprehensive toolkit and a holistic understanding of how to keep themselves and their colleagues safe while covering this election and beyond. And just so everyone knows, recording of the previous three sessions, which have covered risk assessment and planning, online abuse self-defense, and protecting against hacking and doxing, are available on CPJ's YouTube page and on the sign-up page on PEN America's website, and we will, of course, share those links in the chat. We have two more webinars in this series after today, which you can see on your screen. One in a couple of weeks on July the 9th on safely covering protests and navigating police and crowds. And the final session in our series on July the 30th, protecting your mental health in the face of online and offline attacks. During the super election year, where more than half the world's population is heading to the polls, we know that journalists around the world are seeking additional safety support. So I want to acknowledge that both US-based and international reporters are participating today. And while the focus of this series is specifically on reporters working in the United States, the safety tips you'll learn here will be useful, regardless of your geographic location. And a reminder that while our chat is only visible to today's hosts and panelists, we will all actively monitor it and answer your questions as we receive them. So we really encourage lots of questions from the audience today. And we'll go to the next slide, please, Jen. So before I introduce our wonderful speaker today, I'd also like to draw your attention to our community guidelines and agreements, which we have shared ahead of every single session that we've done. So just be aware that some content discussed today may be sensitive, so just be aware of that. Recognize our own and each other's experiences. We want to center learning and center growth throughout this webinar series, and we want to hold collective accountability and respect. In all of our sessions, we want to be open and we want them to be in good faith. And please feel free to make space, but also take space as well. We, of course, again, encourage questions, but what's said here stays here and what's learned here leaves here. And please take care of yourself however you need to today. So I'm now going to introduce Jen Nelson, who will be leading today's session. Jen is Senior Staff Attorney at Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and she leads RCFP's pre-publication and pre-broadcast review practice, oversees the publication of and updates to RCFP's legal guides, which we will share with you in the chat, and supervises the organization's Legal Hotline for journalists. Some of you may be familiar with RCFP's crucially important legal guides and the Legal Hotline. As we all know, journalist safety in the United States is in decline and in flux, and CPJ, the IWMF, PEN America, and RCFP have worked closely with journalists based in the US to ensure they have the tools and resources they need to keep themselves safe. And just to kind of situate us ahead of Jen's presentation today, Here are a few key statistics for the purposes of today's session. According to data from the US Press Freedom Tracker, which is another fantastic resource I'd encourage everybody here to check out, 36 journalists have been arrested or faced criminal charges in the US so far in 2024, which is more than double the number of journalists who were arrested in 2022 and 2023 combined. And secondly, this year, our partner, the IWMF, has been leading newsroom safety across America training in swing states. As part of this initiative, it surveyed more than 350 journalists who participated, and 27% of them said they experienced legal threats. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I'm so excited to be with you all today and provide a legal training for you on your rights and resources related to the 2024 election. And we have some time together today, and so I'm going to encourage questions throughout. Lucy's going to be filtering those up to me. But we're going to cover a lot of ground here. And so just to sort of set the stage, I want to cover some of your access rights when it comes to various election-related materials and locations. So I'll start with that, and then I want to get into some general safety tips and legal rights you have when covering what would be considered, more stressful situations, which unfortunately our elections have become. So I'm thinking crowds, protests, and the like. And then finally, I want to cover some of your legal rights to be aware of when interacting with police. So again, it's going to run the gamut, but it's going to be a lot of information, but I'm, again, really, really open to questions. It's hard to make a webinar conversational, but I'll do the best I can. And then, toward the end, as Lucy mentioned, I know she's going to be sharing some of Reporters Committee's resources in the chat, but I'll have some slides on that as well, including, information about the Reporters Committee's free legal hotline. So starting out with safety and access in the field, and I want to start with some access to records related information when it comes to elections. So the general trend of mail-in ballots and early voting has grown significantly in recent years. And then, of course, it's at least in part due to the lasting effects of the coronavirus pandemic. So, access to voter rolls, ballots, initial ballot count and recount process are increasingly important for journalists, especially where we're having situations where it can take days rather than moments to determine who has won an election. So a good thing to know, and it's very hard for me to go say state by state because the laws vary significantly by state. So it's always helpful to refer to things such as the Reporters Committee's election guide if you are covering a certain jurisdiction and want to know your access rights, but I'll cover some highlights here. And I want to note from the outset that voter registration records are open to public inspection pursuant to each state's public records law. And typically that'll have some information redacted. Some states are a little bit, more fulsome in their records that are available than others. And some will require a fee for access. They'll put it on a CD or will formulate records for you. So there can be a fee involved, but there's actually many states have an option. I know New Hampshire is one of them, where you can just show up in person and get access to information without having to pay for the reproduction fee. Available information can be a lot. For example, in Arizona, you can get name, party preference, date of registration, address, phone number, birth year, occupation. You can just get a wealth of information about voter data. And a lot of states require that this information be turned over rather quickly. Minnesota, for example, requires a 10-day turnaround. But note that there are a few states, Minnesota is one of them, where you must be a registered voter in the state to receive copies of these records. So little things like that can be really important. And I do want to again put in a plug that if you are ever reporting in a jurisdiction and are looking to figure out what your rights are in terms of public records. We have lawyers here on our team that are manning our hotline and are always ready to help you figure out the answers to those types of questions in terms of what you can get access to. When it comes time to get access to actual ballots, the laws vary significantly. Arizona, for example, they're sealed, they're confidential, you can't get access to them. Wisconsin, open, subject to redaction. I actually found a really, really interesting thing when I was updating this year's election guide. The county of Dane, Wisconsin, actually posted what they called a do-it-yourself audit, where they redacted the names, but otherwise posted a file that contained all of the ballot images for the 2022 spring election, so that anyone, if they were curious, could sort of go through and tally the votes themselves, I suppose, if they were really interested in doing so. So you can see a really strong variation in terms of what you might be able to get access to state by state. Just a really interesting aspect of public records laws in America. But if you have access to this information, it can be a real benefit to your reporting. I did want to briefly touch upon campaign events because it is a question we get a lot in terms of, as a journalist, do I have a right of access to a campaign event? And there's some tricky things here. Generally, campaign events are privately funded by political campaigns, and they are thus considered a private space where you can be asked to leave, either granted access or not granted access to. Typically, I will say that, historically, at least, these places have been open to journalists. We have in recent years seen some shifting tides when it comes to that. So I do advise journalists who are covering campaign events to ensure the knowledge of any rules set forth by the campaigns, in order to ensure that you are not, say, asked to leave and then, sort of done reporting for that event, in terms of your continued access. So turning a little bit, I want to touch upon some news gathering legal rights and issues that come up often, both in general reporting, but of course also when it comes to reporting on elections. And so I'm going to touch on recording laws here for a few minutes. Recording in public. And so you're a journalist and you're walking into a restaurant and you want to do sort of like man on the street interviews, something like that. Think of small town diner, whatever you want to do. Generally, if there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in a conversation, it's generally okay to record in-person conversations. I mean, look, you're always going to be best suited by making it clear that you're recording, asking if you can record. That's always going to be the best path, but it's not necessarily a legal requirement. It always begs the question, though, what is a reasonable expectation of privacy? And I have a photo here of a busy restaurant. I'm thinking, if you're sitting and the tables are close together and it's a big crowd of people and you're having a conversation with someone, do you have a reasonable expectation that no one's going to overhear that conversation? The answer is really no. And so that's kind of what courts that have evaluated this question have focused on, sort of considering all the circumstances. It's a reasonable person type standard. Are you in a public place? Are people talking loudly? That sort of thing. Where we're talking about a conversation that is not necessarily in public, say you're in a smaller situation and you want to record an interview that you are doing with a source, it's important to follow your state's recording law. I'll say here, a small plug, rcfp.org/recording. We have a state-by-state guide to recording laws in America. And I'll note broadly that about 38 states and the District of Columbia allow recordings with one party's consent. And so if you are a party to that conversation, you can record without getting permission from the person that you are interviewing or from the group of people, if that is the case. About 12 states, however, and I'll show a map on the next slide here, require all parties to consent before a conversation can be recorded. And there are a couple big states in that, like California, for example. And so a question we often get via our legal hotline is, what do we do about calls between people in different states? Or if we're using cell phones and, I know people who have kept their home state's cell phone, many, many years after moving to a different jurisdiction. And, the courts that have addressed this issue, it hasn't really been fleshed out super well. And it's a little bit muddled. So frankly, if there's any question at all, um, um, it is the better practice, the safer practice to just go ahead and get consent. And oftentimes if you do get consent on tape, just acknowledge, like I said, I'm recording this conversation for purposes of my notes, things like that. I think are always going to put you in the best spot legally. And so it's a map, it's the courtesy of NPR, actually, in a recent training I did with them, in terms of all party versus one party consent jurisdictions. And this information, again, is all available on our website. I also want to talk separately about the right to record police in public, because it's a different issue. And the good news is that all of the courts of appeal, so we're talking about appellate courts in the United States, all courts that have considered this issue to date have recognized a First Amendment right to record police in public. So we're talking about police engaging in their public duty, that there is a right to record. However, that right to record is not universal and without limitation. It is subject to what's known as reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and that is considered a bit of a term of art in the First Amendment space. The idea is that the police are allowed to put some limitations on where individuals might be placed or stand, or how close they can get to certain situations, in order to permit police to engage in their work, and to maintain public safety. And the truth of the matter is that a great deal of deference is provided to police to allow for this sort of maneuvering, if you will. So you can be arrested for failing to follow lawful police orders, particularly if you're in a situation where an unlawful assembly has been gathered, police are ordering the dispersal of the crowd, or if a protest has started to turn violent and there are situations where police are stepping in. Those are a lot of situations where, as a journalist, you're going to want to do your best to record from a safe distance, comply with those police orders, because you can be subject to arrest if you violate them. And look, I mean, the truth of the matter is there may be circumstances where you think police are sort of overstepping their authority. Unfortunately, the remedies for an unlawful arrest come after that arrest, right? And so the goal and the goal of the tips that I'm trying to provide today is to keep you from getting to that point where you are arrested and removed from the field for the day, because obviously that is a huge pain. And so these tips are designed to avoid that. I will note that police are not permitted to specifically target journalists who are otherwise complying with the law. We're really not supposed to be seeing situations, and I'm not saying that means that we are not seeing these situations, but police are not supposed to be able to say, okay, if you're a journalist, you have to come over here and stand in in this area, but other members of the public can be out and about. That's really not supposed to be the way it goes. So where you are seeing police sort of having space or ordering dispersal, it's supposed to apply to everyone, not just to journalists. So these are things to be aware of. I realize I haven't checked in with Lucy on terms of questions. I'll assume, Lucy, just jump in.
No questions right now, so you're good to continue. Thank you so much.
No problem. Feel free to jump in anytime. Turning back again, I think, to news gathering at polling places, I wanted to cover a couple of issues. First, I'll touch upon exit polling. And this is the idea of, journalists posting up outside of polling places, asking voters as they leave to discuss their choices in the ballot box. It is a constitutional right to gather news outside polling places. However, it, again, some restrictions are permissible and they can vary significantly by state. The idea behind these restrictions are usually providing a buffer zone around the polling place, with the policy reasons being to protect voters' safety and the sort of sanctity of the ballot box, if you will. So that's where those restrictions are sort of rooted. And I put up a few examples here, but they can vary significantly in terms of what the distance is. In Georgia, for example, it's 25 feet, North Carolina 50, Nevada 100 feet. Generally, anything beyond 100 feet has been struck down as unconstitutional, as just being too far away to justify the restriction on news gathering. But it is important to just have an understanding of what the law is, what the regulations are in the state in which you're reporting before you head out to the polling place. And I always think that it can be helpful if you are planning on covering a specific polling place to try and get in touch with an election official in advance of the election day. Rather than just turning up, I think that I know anecdotally from journalists I've worked with in the past that they've had success, greater success, talking to people in advance in the run up to election day rather than in the chaos that can be election day itself. Exit polling by phone, not really a thing anymore, but it is still permissible. There are federal restrictions on using pre-dialed, robocalls, but otherwise, if you do have access to voter information that includes telephone numbers, it's okay to call people without prior consent. It's just not as common anymore. I did want to touch upon news gathering at polling places that is not exit polling. And so oh yeah.
We have a question just as you switch slides, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll go back.
Great. So we have a question here just about the time, place, and manner restrictions.
Yes.
And we have a question. Can you please provide an example for each of those time, place, manner restrictions? For example, is a nighttime curfew a time restriction?
A nighttime curfew, yes, that can be considered a lawful restriction. Oftentimes you will see instances where media may be specifically excluded from those types of curfews. But if media are not, then it is applicable to everyone, and you could be subject to arrest for remaining. And usually we're seeing curfews and utilized in terms of protests, but that is where we can see arrests occurring. And then again, obviously, there are questions there. Could there be a successful legal challenge to things like curfew orders or to other restrictions? And perhaps, but again, we're talking about remedies that are occurring after the fact. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Yes, and then any example for time, and then a question about what manner means in that.
Yeah, so time, place, and manner, it's really they're sort of all evaluated together. And so we're sort of thinking, okay, is I'll use the example of say a protest where there's been a fight that has broken out. And police are asking members of the public, which can include journalists, to keep a certain distance back so that police can move in and break things up and sort of handle the situation. And so when you're looking at time, place, and manner, it's okay, was the time that people were asked to sort of be in a different location, was that a reasonable amount of time? It wasn't too long or restrictive. They weren't telling people you have to leave the place, you just you need to back up 10 feet. It's just sort of a totality of the circumstances analysis in terms of is this a reason, are these reasonable steps that are being taken for purposes of ensuring public safety that are not sort of going beyond what would be considered reasonable under the circumstances. It's really squishy, and I think that's what makes it so difficult. I think, again, a lot of deference often provided to police when it comes to that.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Great. Great. So again, news gathering at polling places, apart from exit polling, varies significantly by state. A lot of states, I'd say probably most, restrict photography inside the polling place, and this is given concerns about election security. A lot of times, journalists are not permitted in the election, in the room itself where the voting is taking place. But not all states are like that. Georgia does allow reporters to enter polling places to observe, but they obviously cannot enter, say, the ballot box. Florida will allow public access to journalists to watch procedures before polls open and then after voters have cast their ballots, but the press cannot be in there while the polls are open. Wisconsin is actually pretty permissive, does allow photography and limited recording inside polling places. I believe that that requires advance notice to do that. Don't quote me specifically on that. Again, these nuances are all available in our election guide. If you are planning to cover a polling place, I have found it helpful to advise journalists to familiarize yourself with the regulations that are at play and perhaps consider printing them out and bringing them with you. Our legal hotline is, fully staffed on election day. We get access calls all day. And we have had success where journalists have actually had a printout with them to bring with them and show to sort of prove that they are in a place where they are justified and permitted to be. There can be circumstances where campaign officials or voting officials just simply have a misunderstanding in terms of what your access rights are. And so that could be a tip that could help you out. I'll also touch on access to ballot counting and recounts. Again, this is a state issue. They're responsible for the handling and counting of their ballots. Many generally do not permit mail-in or absentee ballots to be counted before election day. Some states do allow for the processing to occur, but often the actual counting is going to be something that happens on election day itself, or will at least begin on election day. In many states, the press and the public are entitled to observe initial ballot counts and recounts. There are typically restrictions that are deemed permissible in terms of where the public is able to stand and be, and requirements that they not interfere at all with the counting process. So, as with access to polling places, another area where advance notice to election officials can help to ensure access and continued access. Okay, so turning a little bit, a slight pivot, I want to cover just some general, news gathering issues that we see that come up specifically in protest scenarios, and then I'm going to dive into your legal rights surrounding police interaction. Lucy, were there any other questions in terms of election-related access before I pivot?
No, there are not. So please go ahead and pivot.
Great. Okay. So the bummer that I always have to share during these presentations is that laws of general applicability apply to you as a journalist. There's no special exemption for the press. So, most often where we see issues related to press and arrests, a lot of times it is related to trespass, which I'm going to discuss here on the next slide. But I'll note here that while the press may not have a special right of access beyond what the public is entitled to, as I touched on before, when talking about sort of police and reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, the press cannot be denied access that's otherwise provided to the general public, where we're talking about, a publicly accessible space. But trespass is always something to be aware of as a journalist. And the legal definition is entering private property without consent Or, which this sometimes surprises people, trespass can occur if you were initially invited into a space, but then refuse to leave once you are asked to do so. And so that is why you have situations where, if a dispersal order has been given and one fails to leave um, in a timely manner, issues related to trespass can occur. Um, it- Trespass laws vary significantly by state. They can be criminal, they can be civil, so you could be subjected to fines or possible criminal prosecution. And we have seen instances where journalists have been criminally prosecuted for trespass. Oftentimes, though, these charges are dropped, but again, if you're arrested in the field, that is it for you for the day. You have to find a lawyer, you have to get bailed out. It is um, obviously the goal to avoid it. And we have seen an increase in the sort of weaponization or threats of trespass by law enforcement. The most recent example that was sort of very widely publicized, or that was after the tragic school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, where there were a lot of instances of threats of trespass against journalists who were reporting from public sidewalks. It is something that we are aware of here at the Reporters Committee, are often doing our best in situations to communicate with police offices and police departments, and trying to reach understandings about what journalists' rights are in these circumstances, and how best to navigate those situations. See here. But being aware of your surroundings at all times. I know that this has likely been covered in other protest preparation trainings, and CPJ puts these on all the time. And sort of how to be aware of your surroundings and make sure that you are not putting yourself in a position where you are unsafe or subject to legal prosecution. But oftentimes you'll see a situation where a protest starts in a public location, sort of moves on to private land, and having an understanding of your surroundings and where you are and where you might be subjecting yourself to some legal risk are all really, really important. Mhm. So in terms of, I'll briefly touch on these because I know this is also subject to, this might be a little bit repetitive of other trainings that you guys have participated in, but just some of the basics, bringing cash, ID, credit card, wearing your press ID. I think that there are a few different schools of thought on this, on whether it be beneficial if you're in a situation where there might be some animosity towards the press. Maybe not wearing it prominently could help keep you safe, but having it somewhere on your person can be helpful, especially if you are stopped by police. Oftentimes, that is one of the main things that they're looking for. Recognize, of course, that not all journalists will have access to a press ID, particularly if you are a freelancer. But if there's anything that you can have on you that really demonstrates that you are a journalist there to cover what is going on, can be really, really helpful to you in these situations. Again, stating the obvious, paying attention to your surroundings, avoiding breaking the law, recording from safe distances if possible, following police orders, and look, with police, if you are stopped, identifying yourself as press, maintaining a respectful demeanor, but continuing your reporting. It is your right to do so. So with that being said, if there are any questions on this, I'm happy to take it. But from there, I could dive right into navigating police
We
encounters.
do have a question. We do
Great.
have a question. There is a question here. Is there a difference in the definition of trespass between a private property owner as an individual and that owned by a private institution?
Yeah, if you're thinking like an institutional college campus, oftentimes those are going to be applied in the same way. And so that's why, I know there are a lot of individuals that have covered recent protests on school campuses related to the war in Gaza, and those trespass laws will apply. They are considered private where you have a private university considered a private space, they do have the ability to decide that they're only going to let their own students with student IDs on campus. That is something that they're permitted to do, which I know has made navigating reporting on those campuses difficult.
Thank you. We actually have a number of questions coming in, Jen.
Okay,
So I'm just
great.
going so first of all, is there an organization that issues press passes for freelancers?
Mm-hmm. Um, uh, Not one that I am immediately familiar with. I do, I know that this is an issue that Reporters Committee is very much working on. Because again, there is a recognition that providing freelancers with proof of their work um, um, is important. So not at the moment, but it is something that, again, we are working on. So
Thank you. And we actually have I'll just build on that. So there's a
okay.
comment here that someone has helpfully popped in the webinar. Organizations like SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists, the NPPA, the National
Mhm.
Press Photographers Association, and local press clubs like the LA Press Club, for example, issue passes. So for the person who asked that question, those are all great organizations to.
Those are great resources. Thank you.
Yes. And we, before you move on, we do have a question here as well about reporter responsibility and liability while covering protests and law enforcement, if that's something you can comment on, Jen.
Sorry, can you
Sorry.
repeat?
Yes, so we have a question about reporter responsibility and liability. So the
Mhm.
question is, when is a TV, video, or photographer responsible when, for example, carrying a very heavy camera or a piece of equipment, they accidentally bump into law enforcement or the public and somebody gets injured? I guess
Mm,
around liability there.
that is a really tough question to answer broadly because it depends on a lot of different circumstances. And it touches upon what we would call tort liability in the United States, which is this idea of, you've caused a harm to another. Um, and it's just unfortunately simply not something I have expertise in, and it would so much would vary. It depends on the circumstances of the situation, what state you're in, what your actions were compared to the person that perhaps you injured. It is a very complicated question that unfortunately is very dependent on the circumstances.
Thank you for your answer, and to the person who asked it, thank you. And we have just a bit more commentary on press passes, which I know is a very important and crucial question. So,
Yes.
yeah, so we have mentioned NPPA, for
Mhm.
example, other organizations. It's just in wherever you are, it's also important to remember that in some cases your local police department might be the only one who can issue or recognize credentials that they themselves have issued.
Mhm.
Be a case of needing to get those from your local police department.
Yeah.
It may not be enough to get them from an association or journalist organization. So it's always
Mhm.
good. Yeah.
Always good to check, but yes, and so anything is will be better than nothing in those circumstances. But I fully recognize that it can be difficult for a lot of journalists to have those credentials. So, okay, is that all for now? Okay, great.
That's all for now. Thank you.
Okay, so navigating police encounters. And I want to say from the outset, the goal here is to provide you with some uh, high level advice, high level tips and sort of what your legal rights are in certain circumstances. It is really, really difficult to provide sort of a roadmap for how to navigate every single police encounter you could possibly have because so much depends on who the officer is that you're interacting with, what are the circumstances, how stressful is the situation at play. Um, it's very, very difficult to account for all of those different variations and possibilities. But, I will say, um, you're arming yourself with information here. And you will always be generally better off by, knowing your rights and being able to respectfully assert them. Doing so, of course, is no guarantee that those uh, rights will not be violated in certain circumstances. But showing an officer and respectfully that you have an understanding of your rights could very well make it less likely that they would try to violate them. And so those are the goals here today. And I do want to note too that depending on whichever jurisdiction you're in, often the local state chapter of the ACLU will have sort of handy one-page PDFs that will help provide some state-by-state nuances to some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today when it relates to the different types of police encounters. And I'm going to touch on the three types. We're talking consensual, detained, and arrested, and they sort of increase in scale of seriousness. So I'll start with a consensual encounter. And it's sort of a misnomer, right? It's consensual in that it's officer initiated, so that's why it's a little bit of a misnomer. But consensual in that it's the type of question that the average person is likely to respond to. An officer approaches you, not asserting themselves with force, not trying to box you into any corner. And a question such as, oh, who are you reporting with? Like, where are you, who do you work for? Typically in these situations, you do not have to answer. You do not have to engage with the officer. But it's always sort of a case by case in terms of how much, there are circumstances where, if you don't answer, you just sort of walk away. That could, annoy the officer, perhaps escalate a situation. There may be a lot of circumstances where it may be better, you may be better off just respectfully but curtly responding to a couple questions and then asking if you're free to go. But as a general matter, from a legal perspective, you're not obligated to engage with an officer in this type of a situation. If you're uncomfortable, you can evaluate the situation, and generally the standard here is a reasonable person standard in terms of whether or not a consensual encounter has escalated into something more serious. And it's really, am I free to leave? Do I feel free to leave in this situation? And you can ask an officer in these circumstances, am I free to leave? Or just if you do not want to engage, am I free to leave? The officer in this circumstance is obligated to answer. And again, that question, am I free to leave, is just sort of a buzz phrase, if you will. It really signals to the officer that you have an understanding that you're not obligated to engage in this situation, and can ask if you are free to leave. You can always, if you want to, walk away from a consensual encounter for any reason if you're uncomfortable, you just do not want to engage. You could identify yourself as press, but decline to identify yourself further. That is a right that you have. And, I'll make it very, very clear here. You are not required to consent to a search of yourself or your property. If asked, you should calmly and respectfully state that you do not consent to any such search, particularly in this consensual type of encounter. It is always going to be my suggestion to not permit an officer to search you or your belongings. Any questions in terms of consensual encounters before I talk about detainment?
Not right now. Thank you.
Okay. The next stage here is if you are detained. So a brief detainment is permissible by police if there is a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. It must be more than a hunch, but still provides a fair amount of deference to the officer. So it's sort of a middle ground here. Again, if you feel like you have reached a point where you are not being permitted to leave, and the officer is asking you questions, they are becoming more intrusive, You are again asked that free to ask, am I free to leave or am I being detained? Officer again is obligated to answer under these circumstances, certainly supposed to. Um, if they refuse to answer, look, I think that this is sort of a situation where it is helpful if you are reporting in teams, you can have someone who is recording this encounter, or if you are recording the whole time, that's always going to be better than say, starting to record right away. But if you're getting to a situation where you think police are beginning to overstep what their authority should be in a situation, um, having a recording of that is going to be helpful to you. At the very least, if you are unable to record or don't have a device on you, doing your best to remember the circumstances of the situation will be very, very important to provide to your lawyer after the fact. So I'm talking about things like exactly where you were, a description of the officer or their name if you're able to get it, their badge number if you're able to get it. In Wisconsin, actually, it's states vary on this, but in Wisconsin, police officers are supposed to carry business cards that have their badge number on them, and they're supposed to be obligated to give you one of those cards if you ask for it. But not all states operate that way. But little details like that can be really, really important if you're able to remember them. Um, if you are detained and the officer has a reasonable suspicion that you may have a weapon or something illegal on your person, the officer is permitted to check for weapons. This is sort of a pat down of the outer layer. And so I think it's always important to advise as well to be cognizant of what you are carrying. Anything that could be weapon or weapon-like. Things can vary a bit state by state in terms of what might reach that level. But being aware of what you're carrying and what could possibly be considered a weapon. If you are someone who, for example, carries mace for safety and does so lawfully, if an officer discovers that, it's not going to necessarily subject you to arrest, right? But it will be something that would be taken from you for the time of the detainment, while you are being questioned. So be aware of that as well. Let's see. I know I have another thing. At this point, if you are detained, you do have the right to remain silent. You do not have to engage. You do not have to answer questions. And generally, and I think, you've likely heard this many times by now, but identifying yourself as press, stating that you are here to cover the event, and at that point, stating that you are invoking your right to remain silent and that you wish to speak to a lawyer. Really, that should be about it, that you say. I think some people might not recognize that they have this right to remain silent at this intermediary stage, but it does apply here. It doesn't just apply when you are arrested. Again, this could make it more likely that you are detained for a longer period or potentially could be arrested. But in terms of your legal rights, I think it's very, very important for you to know that you do have the right to remain silent at this point in time.
We have a question, Jen.
Great.
If you're a woman, can you request the pat down? So if a police officer needs to do that, can you request that be done by a female police officer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, you can. I don't know that there is a guarantee that would be possible. But I think that there is an increased sensitivity to that type of request, and you are absolutely free to request it. Whether or not it would be possible, I think is perhaps a different question.
Thank you.
Of course. And I want to say too, at these stages where things are starting to escalate, no matter how frustrating the situation is for you, again, doing our best to remain respectful, not engage physically or try to resist in any way are all going to be critically important for you at this stage. If you are detained, it isn't supposed to be for a long time. They're not permitted to take you away from the area in which you are being detained. It's supposed to be brief. If you are getting, again, if you're getting to a point where you're approaching arrest, you will know so rather quickly in these circumstances. So we have to talk about arrest next. Obviously, these are the things that we want to avoid. But it requires, of course, the higher level. So with detainment, I talked about just a reasonable suspicion that criminal activity may have occurred. But this, to be arrested, requires probable cause, a reason to believe a crime was committed. Again, making clear here that you are a journalist, that you are invoking your right to remain silent, and that you want to speak to a lawyer. That needs to be it here if you are being put in handcuffs and arrested. Do not unlock your phone in police's presence. I'll say from the outset that police are not permitted to search your phone without a search warrant. But I always advise folks heading out to report in stressful situations, disable the thumbprint or the face unlocking of your phone. Just, take that off the table. Don't give them any opportunity. Don't consent to the search of your property, although at this point, you can have your materials searched. But it's important if you feel like you are being arrested unlawfully, and I talked about this during detainment, just try and mentally record as much information as possible if someone is not physically recording the arrest. All of this information is going to be really, really critical for you to have and provide to your lawyer once you're able to get in touch with one. Again, being respectful at this point, not resisting, not engaging physically with police in any way. Those can add charges if you at all physically engage with police. It will quickly make the situation spiral. So no matter how much you feel the police have overstepped in a situation where you are being arrested while reporting in the field, do your best to remain calm. I think we've all watched an episode or two of Law and Order. So some of these are going to look really familiar to you. Your Miranda rights will be read to you. Again, asking for a lawyer, then remaining silent. Very, very helpful. Call a lawyer or your editor or your safe person, or the Reporters Committee's hotline. And I do advise that you have a phone number either memorized or written somewhere on your person. Don't rely on your phone. It will be taken from you. I know that people don't really remember phone numbers these days. I very much do not. So having that information somewhere on you is helpful. I do want to give a word of caution if your phone call is being made to someone who's not a lawyer. If you are calling an editor or someone else, assume that officers are going to listen to that phone call. So just be very careful about what you are saying if you're making a phone call to someone who's not a lawyer. If you are calling a lawyer, of course, there is attorney-client privilege. Police are not permitted to listen in to that phone call if you are communicating with an attorney. So you can feel free to be candid if that is the case. But just a word of warning in terms of if you are calling someone who is not an attorney. Things will vary in terms of how long you'll be detained, where you'll be detained, based on the state that you're in and the situation that you're in. But you could be detained for some time before you're either charged or released. You'd be booked, fingerprinted, your belongings will be taken and inventoried. And ultimately bail might be set with or without a hearing. The goal will always be for your attorney to get you out as soon as possible by, making very clear that you were a journalist, that you should not have been arrested in the first place. let your lawyer advocate for you on your behalf in those situations. The Reporters Committee hotline, we are available 24/7 in terms of reporter arrests. And we do have a network of criminal attorneys across the country that have experience in this area, specifically working with journalists who have been arrested. So, just flagging that we are a resource for you if this comes up in the course of your reporting. I do
Yeah.
want to, oh yeah, please go ahead.
Got a question here in the chat.
Great.
Excuse me. So just going back quickly to your point on asking for a lawyer and then remaining silent. Somebody has asked, is there any merit to keeping your verbal, so you've been told you've been told to remain silent. Is there any merit to keeping your verbal comments to continually and calmly repeating "I am press"? Would that help in any way?
I mean, I think once you've made it clear to the arresting officer that you're a member of the media, I don't know that repeating it is going to change anything in that scenario if you're already in the process of being arrested. At that point, the officer has decided to nonetheless arrest you, even though you've identified yourself as press and perhaps shown him or her a press pass. But you are free to do so if you wish. I don't know that it would make any difference in the circumstance, but
Okay, thank you. And we do have some people have asked for the actual legal hotline number, so we have posted.
I have that at the end. Yes.
We'll put that back in the chat. We have a link in the chat to the hotline, but we will post the actual number as well, and Jen will speak about that at the end. So
Yeah, I'll cover that. I will cover that. One other thing I did. Oh, any other questions?
not right now.
Okay, because there's one other thing I want to cover before I get into some of our resources, and we'll have, it looks like plenty of time for questions. I've sort of blown right through this. So, if police ask to see, say, your photos or any of your work product, you do not have to comply with that request. And there are protections available for your work product in terms of if you are arrested. It is critical that you inform the police that you have work product on you that is intended for news gathering purposes and dissemination to the public. There is a law known as the Privacy Protection Act of 1980. I won't get into the nuances of the law, but broadly, it holds that in order to gain a journalist's information, police need to use a subpoena to get your material. They cannot just go through and utilize your material, even if you are subject to arrest. Making clear that you're a journalist and that the material you have on you is important, because in circumstances where after the fact journalists have challenged the police's actions, courts have found it important to analyze whether or not the police knew or reasonably should have known that this was a journalist that they were interacting with and that they were dealing with this journalist's work product. So again, it is important, and perhaps you can come up with a little phrasing, a little script for yourself if you are subject to arrest, saying, "I am press. The material that I have on me is, news gathering material. My notes are news gathering material intended for dissemination to the public. I want to invoke my right to remain silent, and I wish to speak to a lawyer." And that can really be it. But if police ask to see your photos in a situation where we're talking more of a consensual encounter, you do not have to oblige. Police, in order to bypass this lack of consent, they must have what's known as an exigent circumstance. And these three things must be present. They must have probable cause to believe that a crime was committed, and that that crime was captured on your camera. And there must be a strong likelihood that evidence will be lost, that the evidence on your camera will be lost if they do not seize it immediately. And so really seizing on that third one, I think is really, really helpful. Informing the officer, I'm a journalist. These photos are my news gathering, my work product. They will not be, I'm not going to delete them. They will not be destroyed. That will put, again, it's meant to put the officer on notice that they don't have that exigent circumstance available to bypass your lack of consent. Um, Even if police officers take your equipment, if you're subject to arrest, they do require a warrant to see the contents of any of your devices. So there is that extra level of protection available for your work product. And it is important that you, again, assert that this is your work product if you're subject to arrest.
We have a question.
Great.
Um, if police do not give you your call to the lawyer,
Mhm.
they don't give you your call when you've asked for it, after you have been arrested, what do you do then?
Yeah, they're obligated to give you a phone call. There's always a question of how long can this take? What's a reasonable amount of time to have to wait for that phone call? And that's really tough. I don't know that there is sort of a set window that they have to give you that call in. But you do have a right to make a phone call. You have a right to request a lawyer. You have a right to speak to a lawyer. And so that does have to happen, whether that happens immediately or whether there's a waiting period that you're going to be put through. If things are really busy, a lot of people are being processed, it could take some time. Um, but you need to be provided that phone call.
Thank you.
Great. Let's see. I'll touch upon as well, under no circumstances are police permitted to say go into your phone without your consent or go into your camera without your consent and delete photos. If this occurs, this is also something to document as much as possible and share with your lawyer, because again, these will be things that they want to know. I want to share some other resources, and then I'll touch upon our legal hotline, which I know there was a question about. CPJ, of course, has a lot. First Amendment Watch has a lot of great resources. NPPA has practical advice on their website about covering high conflict news stories. The Police Protesters and the Press Guide on Reporters Committee's website has been recently updated. We also have a protest tip sheet that provides sort of a shortened, more condensed guide to some of your legal rights and things to keep in mind if you are covering stressful situations. Okay. And our legal hotline. There are a few ways to reach us, and they all sort of go to the same set of attorneys, but it's really your preference. We have our phone number, which is 1-800-336-4243. And that is the best way to reach us if you are subject to arrest outside of business hours on the East Coast. So we're talking 9 to 5. We have an answering service that will funnel these types of emergency calls to a phone tree of attorneys here at the Reporters Committee to help connect you potentially with criminal counsel in the state where you need to find help. So the phone number is best if you need us after hours. If you have a question on, say, public records laws with regards to voter registration information in Montana, we're here for that as well. You can use the phone if you want. You can also use rcfp.org/hotline. And I think that tends to be our preference for some of the less emergency questions because it allows you to fill out the full scope of your question. And then, one of our attorneys can evaluate it and get back to you with some, helpful tips. We cannot provide formal legal advice via the hotline, but we can point you in the right direction in terms of what some of the access laws are like in whatever state you're reporting. We can also make referrals to attorneys or consider taking on matters internally at the Reporters Committee via the hotline, in which situation, if you were to become a formal client of ours, we then would be able to provide you formal legal advice. But anything related to news gathering, these are all things that we're ready to help you with. And I will sort of wrap it up from there. I would love to hear if you have any additional questions. I got through this material quicker than I was expecting. So,
Thank Jen, thank you so much. This has been really enlightening and I think very, very helpful for everyone here. We do have a question, and then I actually have a question.
great.
So we have a question. If we go back to kind of the three-pronged arrest
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at, and we go back to a journalist asking, "Am I free to go now?"
Mm-hmm.
Question is this standard operating procedure for law enforcement around the country? What circumstances could or would police say, no, you're not free to go, and be justified in saying that?
Yeah. So if they say no, you're not free to go, then you know that you have reached that level where you have been detained. And at that point, it's a question for you. Do you want to keep engaging with the officer at this point, or do you want to invoke your right to remain silent? And so really that's why that question is there. Am I free to leave? Am I being detained? Because that lets you know where in the situation, in terms of like your own legal risk, your own legal evaluation of what is going on here, whether they have reached that stage where you are being detained and could possibly be subject to arrest. Um, so it's a question, I think, of how much you want to engage. This will be a situation where the officer has a reasonable suspicion, whether or not that bears out, that criminal activity has occurred, and they have stopped you in order to ask you questions about that. Um, Again, it is the question, am I free to leave or am I being detained, is really to help you understand where in the process you are. And whether or not you need to, I think, start to gather information for purposes of your own safety, your own defense, if it does escalate to an arrest.
Great, thank you. And from me, so going back to the resources that you shared at the end of
Great.
the presentation, I know that the Reporters Committee has a really great guide on the upcoming conventions. So the DNC and the RNC, and we will post those in the chat, and then we'll also, after today's webinar, share with everyone here an email with all of the resources that were mentioned today.
That's great. Yeah.
Yes. Now I know that the Reporters Committee is also doing some upcoming training around both the DNC and the RNC, and I'm sure that in this in our audience today, there are people who will be covering either or both conventions. So on like this is not specific convention training today, but if there's
Mhm.
any like high level broad tips for
Yeah.
the DNC or the RNC that we could share today, I think that would be super useful.
Yes, I am indebted to you for bringing that up. It's very, very helpful. Thank you. So yes, we are putting on a free training along with Mickey Ostreicher, who's general counsel for NPPA and is incredibly knowledgeable. He's been covering conventions since the 70s. And so he's just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this. Our one for the RNC for Milwaukee is this coming Thursday. You can go to our website, and I know Lucy has the link. She'll provide the link. If you'd like to sign up for that training, it's free. It'll be about an hour, although we have a lot of content to cover. I'm fearing that we might run over a little bit. Um, but it's really going to cover, there will be some overlap. It's going to cover some of these issues related to arrests and your legal rights surrounding interactions with police. But we're also going to provide a lot of information that is specific to both Milwaukee for purposes of the RNC and Chicago for purposes of the DNC. So the one on Thursday is focusing on Milwaukee. And we've taken a look at what security measures are currently in place and what sort of is remaining in flux. And that relates to the security zone that is being established by the Secret Service surrounding the convention itself. And it's going to be really, really important for you to have an understanding of what is permitted inside this zone, what is not permitted. A really touchy area is Milwaukee's inability to I think, restrict guns, frankly, due to state law. So I think that we're keeping a close eye on a lot of risks, potentially to journalists. Um, and just how crazy things can get when it comes to protests and where those protests will be and how, restrictions that will be in place. Those are all things that we are going to cover. Um, in addition, covering Milwaukee specific regulations that are applicable to police and how it's supposed to guide police interaction with the media, specifically in Milwaukee. So there will be very, uh, Milwaukee specific information that will be covered during that training.
Fantastic. Thank you. And again, we will share all of those links
Yes.
in our follow-up email.
Mhm.
So speaking of interacting with police, we have another question on that topic.
Sure.
So do you have any guidance related to really how far or how close or how far away should press be from police
Mm,
before
yeah.
is there a general rule about the distance you must be from police before
Mhm.
being charged with obstruction?
Yeah, and I think that there have been some state laws that have been attempted in recent years to try and put boundaries on where the press may be or put buffer zones, if you will. And those have been challenged repeatedly as unconstitutional. And so we have some challenges that are ongoing to some state laws. I do think though when it comes to something like obstruction, you really do have to be sort of really inserting yourself into the situation. So, I don't have like oh, 6 feet is fine. I don't have any general guidance like that to provide. Because again, it's really case and context specific. But we're talking sort of a reasonable person standard. Like are you far enough away that the officer is able to do what they are trying to do? Without say, having to like bat away your camera or something like that. But again, uh, it is you want to make a reasonable effort, which can be difficult if we're talking about crowds and circumstances, right? But you want to make a reasonable effort to ensure that you're not interfering with police activity. Just doing your best.
Great. Thank you. Okay, if there are, this is a last call for any questions for Jen, who I think has also helpfully provided her email
Yeah.
for folks who can get in
Yeah.
touch.
Stay in touch.
Yes, so I think with that, I'm going to wrap us up today. So thank you so much to Jen Nelson, Senior Staff Attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. We really thank you, Jen, for your time and your expertise. I hope everyone will use these wonderful resources and guides. Please look up the Reporters Committee training that's coming up. And our next webinar in this series, so the 5th webinar, Journalist Safety Covering the Election, Protest Policing and Crowds, will take place on Tuesday, July the 9th at 12 p.m. That webinar will build on this webinar that we've all participated in today, and will focus on your physical safety while covering protests and interacting with police and crowds. So thank you again, Jen. Thank you again, everyone, for coming today, and please have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.